we have, in a sense, reached the climax of the establishment of the covenant of God with Israel at Mount Sinai. 73 of the elders of Israel, Aaron and his 2 sons and 70 elders, had a vision of God. They were brought up into the mountain. And now we begin anew. Welcome to another tidbit from the book of Exodus. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and today we are in particular to look at some of the connections between these exciting chapters in Exodus and the New Testament, which in many ways makes use of these texts to present the gospel. Let's look at what you find in these chapters 24 to 31 in the book of Exodus. We finish off, in a sense, the formal establishment of the covenant in verse 11. And then something new happens. Moses and Joshua are walking up on the mountain, invited by God. They stay a little below the summit for 6 days, and on the 7th day, the Sabbath day, Moses enters into the presence of God and he stays with God for 40 days. And during these 40 days, God speaks to him and tells him how to build the tabernacle and the various elements of it. That is described in 7 speeches, beginning 21. The first verse, God speaks to Moses, and he said, and lo and behold, the 7th one in chapter 31 does not speak in particular about the sanctuary, it speaks about the Sabbath. And you find in these chapters, from 1 to 7 of these speeches, a lot of elements that point back to the creation. But I'll leave that for now. Let's go back and look at some of the important tidbits from these chapters. First, from chapter 24. When you come to verse 9 and 7 and 8, you find that Moses takes the blood of the sacrifice and he is sprinkling the people with this blood of the covenant. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that in the epistle to the Hebrews, in chapters 9 and 10, you will find that this and other texts are reused in connection with the inauguration of the heavenly sanctuary. Now, it is important to notice this is the inauguration. And of course, that means that the blood will be sprinkled on all areas in the sanctuary, including the most holy. Not because it's the Day of Atonement, but because it's the inauguration. Legally, from a forensic point of view, the heavenly sanctuary could only be inaugurated when the perfect sacrifice had been brought. And that sacrifice Jesus brought on Calvary. And all the sacrifices and all the blood of the sacrifice in the Old Testament sanctuary, in the tabernacle, later in the temple, pointed to that one and only sacrifice by Jesus. Back in the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Ballinger attacked the sanctuary service and claimed that it had been in place already before Christ. That is, that the holy service, the department in the holy, had its fulfillment in the Old Covenant during the Jewish dispensation, and then the Most Holy and the Day of Atonement began when Jesus came or entered heaven after his resurrection. Desmond Ford had similar views, not expressed as radical, in as radical a way as Ballinger. Nevertheless, notice this is, when you look at the gospel, not possible. The legal foundation for the inauguration of the heavenly sanctuary must be the completion of the perfect sacrifice that happened by Jesus on the cross. Could not have happened before that. Now, as we move on, there are many other tidbits we could highlight. In chapter 25, in the verses 8 and 9, you have a statement which indicates purpose. God wants to live among his people. You are to make me a sanctuary so that I can have my abode with them. And you are to make it exactly as you have seen it, because God will show him on the mountain how it is to be built. There's a heavenly pattern. Now, the two words used for sanctuary and for abode, there's mikdash from Kodesh, be holy. This is the normal word for holy. And then you have mishkan. Mishkan from shakan, to live with, to abide with. Then the abode. What is interesting is that the abode of the nomads and of Israel at the time, the abodes were tents. So the word has to do with also with the tent. And in the New Testament, when John in chapter 1 speaks about the Word that became flesh and tabernacled among us in John 1:14, he's using the Greek word for tenting among us. There is even an etymological connection between mishkan from shakan and skene. Note the sounds S-K and N in the Greek word for tent, and iskenosen, he tabernacled among us. Is that a reuse of the text in Exodus? Surely. John continues, and we saw his glory. And the term glory, the Hebrew kavod, is a central term in this whole account in Exodus of how God came with his glory to settle and to live and to pitch his tent among his people, to be close to them. And theologically, of course, it means that God wants to live with his people. There is, however, a distance due to sin that can only be overcome by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And the earthly sanctuary from the tabernacle through the temple period pointed to that fact. That earthly temple, that tabernacle in the wilderness, was only a copy, a shadow of the heavenly pattern, of the heavenly sanctuary. That is clearly expressed later in chapter 25, in Exodus. Be sure that you make the tabernacle according to the pattern you were shown on the mountain. So God has shown Moses the heavenly sanctuary. This is the pattern. And now he is to rebuild in earthly dimensions a tabernacle which would reflect, be a shadow of, a copy of the heavenly. Throughout the Old Testament, that was always indicated. When King Solomon dedicated the temple and prayed to God in 1 Kings 8, the whole point was God, you are not able to dwell. You cannot be fixed. You are far too great to live in a human-built abode. You live in heaven. But this building, this temple that we now erect today, when we come and pray there, or we turn to that temple and pray, then hear us in heaven where you live. So the earthly temples and tabernacles were copies, they were patterns, they were shadows of the heavenly, which is what exactly is emphasized in the New Testament application or interpretation. In Hebrews chapter 8 especially, you can read the first couple of verses, or in the speech by Stephen in Acts 7, where he highlights this fact that Moses was shown in heaven how the temple should be, the tabernacle should be, and then Isaiah and the Psalms would indicate God could not live constrained to a human building. His real sanctuary is in heaven. The heavenly sanctuary is a real one. And that was the intention, to teach that from the very beginning. Now, my last tidbit from these chapters will emphasize that the theme of Exodus, that God wants to live with his people. He wants to be close to them. You find this theme indicated from the very beginning. You see it when God reveals himself to Moses at the burning bush. You see it in some of the core verses in connection with the establishment of the covenant. God speaks to his people. He wants to invite his people up, but they are afraid. They're afraid of the glory of God. And it's seen in the completion, in the ending of the book of Exodus, when God came down and lived with his people, illustrated by the cloud of his presence. It is also illustrated by the emphasis on the Sabbath. The last of the 7 speeches by God to Moses in these chapters 25 to 31 deals with the Sabbath. The Sabbath as a day is a day where you do not work. God has done all the work, but you rest because God is visiting you. He wants to be with you. His presence is there. And the Sabbath is a sign of that presence. Thank you for listening to this tidbit from the Bible, this time from Exodus, the book of Exodus, as we are reading this book this particular quarter. And welcome back as we continue with a tragic story next time.